Alright, so today we'll be talking about the American Revolution and kind of how it began and what caused it and how it started. What do you know about the American Revolution?
Okay, so I know Pilgrims on the Mayflower formed 13 colonies.
Okay. So the American Revolution, also known as the War of Independence, the conflicts arose from growing tensions between residents of Great Britain, which was led by King George III, and the 13 North American colonies and the colonial government. Okay, and this was from 1754 to 1783. Okay, and then here you can see the southern colonies and the middle colonies and the New England colonies. And you see how they were all on the east of the United States because it was near New England.
New England.
Okay.
Okay.
So here's the key events leading to the American Revolution. So it kind of began, like I said, 1754, the French and Indian War, which ended in 63, and then the Proclamation of 1763 began on October 7th. Sugar Act passed in 1764 on April 5th. Stamp Act was 1765, March 22nd. And then all this went on, and we'll get more in depth with these in a second here. Okay, so the French and Indian War was the beginning. French and Native Americans were allies versus the English and their Native American allies. So the main conflict was over control of the land, right? So colonists fought alongside the British, and many historical figures of the Revolution got their experience in this war, including George Washington, which is kind of where he started, yeah, and became known as a great general. Okay, and then so the Proclamation of 1763, the colonists helped the British win the French and Indian War. This victory gave England the land west of the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River, as you can see from the map there. King George III of England made a proclamation or an announcement in 1763 that the colonists could not go past the Appalachian Mountains. Okay? The colonists resented not being able to settle in the west of the proclamation line. So this angered the colonists since they believed it was their right to do so. Okay, so and then we move on to the Sugar Act, which was in 1764. And it started because the government of Britain needed money to pay off the cost of the French and Indian War because they had spent so much money on this war and expenses for running colonies and newly acquired territories. So the act was taxed on sugar, wine, molasses, and coffee.
Okay.
And tax on molasses almost stopped the rum trade from New England, and the colonies there protested. So it put a 3-cent tax on foreign refined sugar and increased taxes on coffee, indigo, and certain kinds of wine. And then with this, we move on to the Stamp Act, which was when Parliament of Great Britain imposed a direct tax on colonies of British America. The purpose of the tax was to help pay for troops stationed in North America after British victory in the 7 Years' War. The Americans said that there was no military need for the soldiers because there was no foreign enemies on the continent, and the Americans had always protected themselves against the Indians. Stamp became mandatory on legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other papers used throughout the colonies. The colonists protested, refused to pay tax, burned stamp papers, and boycotted British products and merchants. Okay. And then also the Townshend Act was in 1767, and the English Parliament passed the Townshend Revenue Acts, imposing a new series of taxes on the colonists to pay for the cost of administering and protecting the American colonies. Items taxed included imports such as paper, tea, glass, lead, and paints. The act also established a colonial board of customs commission in Boston. The indirect tax was collected at the seaports before items reached colonial stores. Therefore, when the colonists went to buy these items, the tax was already included in the price, unlike the Stamp Act, where the colonists were aware of the added tax. The colonists did recognize the indirect tax and once again boycotted British goods. Colonists were extremely upset with the unjust form of taxation without representation, and this is what basically began the the war because people were upset that they were paying taxes and they weren't being represented for it, okay? And then this jumps into the Boston Massacre, which was in 1770, and it occurred on March 5th. So a squad of British soldiers come to support a sentry who was being pressed by heckling and snowballed crowd, let loose shots. Okay, so yeah, people were they were upset about taxes, and they were there was a crowd of people, and there was British soldiers, and they were kind of pushed and backed up against the wall, and then a few of them shot out, and it was led by a British officer in charge, Captain Thomas Preston. He was arrested for manslaughter, along with 8 of his men. All were later acquitted, which was because of they were actually put on trial thanks to
the snowball fighters that got murdered.
Well, yeah, they were throwing snowballs at them, so they felt threatened, and that's why they
fired.
Yeah, that's why they fired at them.
That's kind of sad because it just snowballs.
And that's when John Adams actually wanted to make sure they were tried the correct way, and that's when he kind of stepped in there. The British troops had been given home in Boston in October 1768 after repeated requests from British custom officials who had been harassed and immediated because of their efforts to enforce the Townshend Acts. The killings of March 5th prompted termed a massacre by Patriot leaders and comraded in a widely circulated engraving by Paul Revere. The event in Boston helped to unite the colonies against Britain. What started as a minor fight became a turning point in the beginnings of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre helped spark the colonists' desire for American independence, while the Dead Riders became martyrs for liberty. Because that massacre really helped everybody see the big picture and really realize that they needed to do something to kind of stop this threat that they had with New England. Okay, so Boston Tea Party was in 1773, and the Boston Tea Party was a direct response from colonists to oppose tea, which was taxed by someone other than their own representatives. So on December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty were led by Samuel Adams, dressed up as Mohawk Indians, and headed to the Boston harbor. These radical patriots quickly and quietly boarded 3 different ships, arming themselves with axes and hatchets. The group, disguised as Native Americans, threw 342 crates of tea overboard, destroying this precious British tea. The act of defiance made King George III furious, and he told the patriots they would be punished. So this was probably something you've heard a lot about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of a big, really kind of starting point in the American Revolution.
I see.
So due to the Massachusetts constant resistance to the parliamentary rule, and as punishment for the Boston Tea Party, the king and his parliament passed a series of laws to limit the political and geographical freedoms. So these laws were called the Coercive Acts or Intolerable Acts, which is what you mainly know them as, Intolerable Acts. So the Boston Harbor would be closed until the East India Tea Company was repaid fully for the tea lost at the Tea Party. Quartering Act was extended to publicly occupied buildings. British officials could not be tried in colonial courts for their crimes. Instead, they would be sent back to Britain to receive punishment. So colonial charters, which started rules and governments set up, were annulled, and British governors were in complete control of town meetings. The border of Canada was now extended into the western colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Okay, so these were by far the harshest of the acts passed. Those living in Boston and Massachusetts would lose money from the Boston Port Act, be forced to provide housing to soldiers throughout the Quartering Act, and be denied some of the same freedoms as other colonists received throughout the Quebec Act. The colonists called for a convention. Okay. So the First Continental Congress was in 1774, and then representatives from colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss their rights. The Congress voted to cut off colonial trade with Great Britain until Parliament abolished the Intolerable Acts. So Congress also decided to begin training men for war, fearing war with England was inevitable at this point. King George III in Parliament did not acknowledge or respect the request of the colonists. So King George just wasn't willing to kind of work with them at all. So he was upset. Battle of Lexington and Concord was in 1974, and the British soldiers marched out of Boston to seize the colonists' gunpowder and firearms in Concord, Massachusetts. Paul Revere helped alert the Minutemen that the British were on the move by hanging lanterns in the church steeple. He also rode through the town to warn that the British are coming. Although the Minutemen were ready for the British in Lexington, Massachusetts, they were outnumbered and defeated. Messengers were also able to warn colonists in Concord, Massachusetts, and only a portion of the supplies were destroyed. Do you know what a Minuteman is?
No.
Minutemen, basically nobody was trained for war. They all just had to be ready to fight and stand up and go out and just be ready. That's why they were called Minutemen. They had to be ready to minute. Okay? They didn't have proper uniforms. They didn't have, all the stuff that typical people would have for war. They just had their rifle, and that was it. They were just ready to go. They were just at home minding their business, and then they just had to be ready to go out and fight. And then Paul Revere, he was the one that says the British were coming. And